We left off in our last study at a point of high drama. 3,000 men of Israel, an enormous posse, had come to arrest Samson and hand him over to the Philistines. This tells us of the sad spiritual and moral state of the people of Israel. Rather than collect together this 3,000 men and perhaps gather even more and join Samson in battle against the Philistines, the Israelites had become comfortable in their sin. They'd become comfortable worshipping foreign gods, and they no longer wished to worship Yahweh and be delivered from their oppressors. And therefore, they arrest Samson, but he makes them promise not to hurt him. And they hand him over to the Philistines, and that's where we pick up the narrative. Verse 13, so they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Oh boy. The Philistines are emboldened, seeing their enemy bound. They shout and rail against their Hebrew enemy. Many imagine Samson was a Mr. Universe type, a hulking, flexing giant of a man. But the evidence in the text of the story tells a different tale. If he was a Goliath-type behemoth, they wouldn't have inquired as to the source and secret of his strength. Samson was an unremarkable-looking ordinary fella, maybe 5'7" or 8, wearing a medium to medium small size shirt. This little fella caused all that destruction? Then we see in verse 14, as the threats and shouts of the Philistines reached a crescendo, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, like Popeye downing a can of spinach, like Thor with the hammer arriving in hand, as the ropes melted from his hands and arms. And with lightning speed, his hand latched onto a jawbone. The Philistine faces, red flushed from shouting boastful and angry words, instantly turned a ghostly shade, a pale white grey. Before them now loomed their worst nightmare. The rumours they'd heard of Samson were true. He was a superhuman killing machine, impervious to their weapons, faster than a shooting arrow. The blurring hurricane of death and carnage, death incarnate. This was the killing fields of the Philistines, 1,000 dead. How was this possible? Who could stand against this tiny killer empowered by the awesome Hebrew God? Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi. 3 things I want to bring to your attention in these verses. Ramoth Lehi, or Jawbone Hill in English. What a great name for a famous battleground. Secondly, Samson uses the jawbone of a dead animal to assist him in this feat, further adding to his Nazirite compromises. A Nazirite is to stay clear of the dead, not use body parts of the dead animals as a tool. And thirdly, his statement, I have slain 1,000 men. Not the Spirit of the Lord has accomplished this great thing, or even God has given me the victory, but I have slain 1,000 men. I have. There's no sign of humility in the life of Samson. He's a self-centered, narcissistic, spoilt man baby. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En-Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. God will usually allow triumphs in our lives to be tempered with trials. And if triumphs are tempered with trials, they can often become points of pride. So God allows this great thirst of Samson. So Samson realizes, as powerful as God has made him, he still needs God to deliver him. But even with this trial of thirst, Samson doesn't humble himself before God. Samson was an isolated man. And isolated men serving God are in danger of asserting themselves in ungodly ways. It's so much easier to lead a Christian ministry from isolation. That's why so many pastors bully their congregation for absolute control, absolute authority. But if you lead from isolation, you're headed for a fall. If you don't have people in your life who can pull you up or correct you, you're in danger. How do you respond to criticism? I've seen numerous Christian leaders and read about many more who always respond badly with aggression to any criticism. I'm doing the Lord's work, all opposition is satanic, is the mindset they get themselves into. It's a wonderful thing to receive godly feedback on deficiencies in the way you're ministering for God. We all have failings. We all have shortfalls. Ask yourself this question: who's getting the glory when you're exercising your spiritual gifts and abilities? And if the answer isn't Jesus Christ and Him alone, you need to get on your knees before God. The name He gives this life-giving spring was En-Hakor, in English, fountain of the crier. Not fountain of Yahweh, Samson's fountain. What a baby Samson is. I've seen a woman. Get her for me. He loses the bet, so he murders 30 men. They marry off his wife, the woman he rejected. So he spits the dummy and destroys an entire town's economy. He's now just killed 1,000 Philistines. And the big baby Samson is whining melodramatically about dying of thirst. What's remarkable is that God continues to indulge this man baby by miraculously supplying water. Seriously, if God can use this carnal man, He can use anyone. He can even use me and you. The word judge or judged is very loosely applied when it comes to Samson. He gave no military tactical directions to his people, to anyone. He led or arranged no army at all. He offered no rulings on law, this lawless man. He provided no spiritual oversight. He was a man without spiritual, any sort of integrity. He just descended from privilege, gradually down into deeper and deeper sin. Israel at this time was so perverse, so morally corrupt. Samson was their perfect judge. A simple man-baby brute who on occasion gave the Philistines a whipping when they were stupid enough to annoy him. It's very rare for a good and godly man or woman all of a sudden to fall into great sin. The life of Samson demonstrates to us it's usually a process over time. One compromise after another, one lie upon another, sin upon sin, before you realise you're in over your head. In a situation you can't extract yourself from, deep in a pit of sin and trouble. Samson's life also teaches us to be careful who we're in a relationship with. Be careful who you date. Be extra careful who you marry. Israel were told not to marry the pagan outsiders, lest you fall into compromise with the outside religions. The exact same principle applies to Christians today. Be careful who you date. Be extra careful who you marry. The New Testament warns us not to be unequally yoked. And we learn in this narrative from Samson's life, it's never right to do wrong to do right. The ends don't justify the means. We would be wise to remember an important life lesson from Samson's actions. Vengeance begets retribution. When tempted to seek revenge, ask God for the strength to rather respond with kindness, forgiveness, and love. Most importantly, we learn the power of Samson didn't come from his physique or his Nazirite vow, not even from his long hair. His power came from the Spirit of God. Likewise, anything we accomplish of lasting eternal value comes as a work of the Holy Spirit through us. When we look at the life of Samson, we see a man with no sense of the fear of the Lord. Samson was carnal, fleshly, worldly. There's no sense in his life that he feels accountable before a righteous, perfect, holy, and fearsome God. There's no sign of humility in his life, no attempt to give God credit for any work God achieved in Samson's life. There's no evidence he took any care to honour the Nazirite vow proclaimed by Jesus over his life. We need to ensure that we learn from the failings of Samson. We must live with a due respect, reverence and fear of the living God. And this must be reflected in the way we live.